Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's forum with historian Edward J. Larson on his new book, American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. I'm Allison Schilling, Deputy Director and Director of Engagement here at the Concord Museum. It's my privilege to be moderating today's forum with Professor Larson. Edward J. Larson is a professor of history at Pepperdine University, where he also holds the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law. The author of numerous books and essays, Professor Larson won the Pulitzer Prize for his History of the Scopes Trial, Summer of the Gods. Professor Larson has lectured on all 7 continents, delivered the Supreme Court Historical Society Lecture in Washington, and is frequently interviewed on The Daily Show, The Today Show, and other media outlets. Professor Larson received his PhD in the history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, his law degree from Harvard University, and his Bachelor of Arts from Williams College. Today we are here to discuss Professor Larson's latest book, American Inheritance, which was recently released and has been receiving much acclaim. The book addresses the history behind our current debates over the centrality of slavery to the origins of the United States. As John Meacham's review in the New York Times Book Review put it, Edward J. Larson's American Inheritance is a welcome addition to a public conversation in the wake of the New York Times' 1916 project. Larson's sober new book repays reading, for it has a good deal to teach those who want to see American story in overly simplistic terms. Ed, the last book you published before American Inheritance was on Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, and briefly touches what has become this new book. So why did you decide to expand on that narrative and tell it through the broader lens of this time period, 1765 to 1795, instead of focusing on the founders as you did in Franklin and Washington?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I am just blown away by the museum. I was here in the 70s when I was a student, and this is nothing like the museum. This is amazing. You should be commended. It's so nice for you to have me back out. And on such a lovely day in Concord, I got to walk out to Walden Pond, accompanied only by lots of mosquitoes, but also some lovely wildflowers. You're right, it was the last chapter of that last book that ended up prompting this. That book came out just before the COVID pandemic. And indeed, the book tour for it was actually, I was in the middle of the book tour when COVID sent everybody home. I remember the empty airplane I flew back from the East, flew back in. But as I went on it, and I didn't expect this, I really wasn't thinking about it, but the last chapter, I mean, that book deals with the interrelationship and the interactions of the two indispensable people of the Revolutionary era. All historians would agree that Franklin and Washington were the two indispensable Americans. Everyone else, Hancock was important. I'm not taking away John Adams or John Hancock or Samuel Adams, but Franklin and Washington stood head and shoulders above the rest, as they all testified. And they had worked together ever since the French and Indian War, because one ran the militia of Pennsylvania and one the Virginia, and of course, they overlapped because they both claimed the forks of the Ohio. Both colonies claimed that, and that's where the war started. So they worked together throughout. And they had had a very respectful relationship, and then they worked very closely during the Revolution. And they worked closely, but by the time of the Constitution, Franklin had turned against slavery. He was the president of the first abolitionist society in America, the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. And he was that while he was governor of Pennsylvania for 3 terms, between the end of the Revolution and the start of the and the Constitutional Convention during that period. So he was the host governor for the Constitutional Convention. He was, of course, from Massachusetts, as you all know. But Washington, of course, remained a slaveholder and was party to, that'd probably be the best way to phrase it, the compromises in the Constitution that made the Constitution a document that would protect slavery in the states that wanted it, in the southern states. And Franklin and Washington split over that issue then, but after Washington was inaugurated and during the first term, and Franklin was still alive, he sent petitions to Congress to try to get Congress to do everything it could do to oppose slavery. And there was a real break between Franklin and Washington. And Washington was terribly upset. And Franklin was determined and wrote some powerful pieces. And so, rather than go into all those details, more people asked me about that than anything else in the book while I was doing this book tour on Franklin and Washington. And I thought that period was very interesting, don't get me wrong. And I did quite a bit of original research to pull that story together. But I didn't anticipate the level of interest of that over the French and Indian War period, or their working together during the Revolution, or pulling the strings to get the Navy at Yorktown. There were a lot of other things. And the interest in that was such that my editor listened to it, and I also picked up on it. And then COVID came, and I had a lot of free time. A lot of free time. And of course, I had materials from that period, but I also had pretty good access to archives, and I knew where things were. And so we just decided, well, why don't we take that? Because it is surprising. It really surprised me that there isn't a book before on this topic of the issue of slavery combined with the issue of liberty or just the issue of slavery. There are wonderful books about, individuals in there, or individual enslaved people, or Phyllis Wheatley, or different cases, Oney Judge activity, but not a comprehensive book that deals with the whole period of the Revolutionary era. There's some great ones on the early period. There's Edmund Morgan's famous classic, American Freedom, American Liberty, American Slavery, about the 1600s in Virginia. There's Benjamin Quarles' amazing book about African Americans in the Revolutionary War. Amazing book. And that was from the 60s. But nothing trying to do what this was. And there was so much interest, I figured, well, I got plenty of time. Let me do it. And so this was my COVID project. And it kept me occupied as my kids gradually came home and went back again. And, we all have our COVID stories. And I was pretty well, had my little project. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I tried to use all the people who'd written on parts of it, but then I never relied on their work. I always would take any of their work and go back to the primary sources, because I knew of the controversies over this, that I would have to cross every T and dot every I by having everything based on primary sources that I cited, because the controversies develop when people attack from one side or the other something written in this period when it's not backed up. It's supposition. Oh, well, this makes sense, and therefore, it makes sense that Americans were revolting to protect slavery. I mean, that might make intrinsic sense, but let's look at the materials and try to back up what everything was. And so that's what I thought I'd do, and I had time to do it, and this was the result. So it was absolutely fascinating, depressing at times, not just because of COVID, because the subject matter and what I found, but exhilarating at times as well. So, too long an answer to your question.
So let's set the stage. So would you describe what is unique about America as this home of chattel slavery when in England, there's no slavery, hasn't been for many, many years.
Right.
How does this Enlightenment era, Locke, Rousseau notion of liberty
Right.
start to arise in America?
Yeah, America was, the revolutionary America brought forth these characteristically American, the institution of slavery and the modern, as it would have been, 1700s modern, idea of liberty. And as Lincoln would say in the Gettysburg Address, we were a nation conceived in liberty. And I think he's right. I think that if you think about other countries, what's England? England's an island. What's Thailand, the land of the Thais? What's Poland, the land of the Poles? What's, Israel is a Jewish religious institution. India is increasingly was created as a Hindu place for Hindus. What were we? What was America? I mean, it was a stretch of these colonies. What else holds them together? Well, Lincoln concluded that they were held together by this shared conception of liberty, that the Americans at the time, broke with England over the idea that our liberty, the liberty here, the liberty in Concord, the liberty in the colonies was being taken away. And how did they conceive of liberty? And it wasn't, certainly there were English precedents, but there were modern English precedents. Because traditionally in England, you had a monarch, and the monarch was inherited, and the lords were inherited, and people lived in manors, and then 90% or whatever the people were peasants of some sort, depending on whatever term you call them, but they're tied to the land. They have to work on the manors. That's where they can't go anyplace else. They're not enslaved, but they're not free in any way we'd think about it. But in the late 1600s and early 1700s, in the wake of the Enlightenment, or as part of the Enlightenment, you have people like Rousseau in France or Locke in England, two people you mentioned, and others like that, coming up with this romantic conception, or I guess it was pre-romantic, it'd be some sort of a fictional conception, that people were, at the original, were born free. Everyone was born free in a state of nature and then contracted together to form governments, giving up some of their freedom to get security and property. And it wasn't just, other writers this was the current idea. It doesn't go back. The Greeks never talked like that. The Romans didn't talk like that. This was an Enlightenment era thinking. And in America, that seemed so true, because Americans, the people who came over to Massachusetts, for example, in the 1600s, the people who came to Virginia, the people who they were coming, Pennsylvania, they came to a newfound land, and putting aside the Native American stories here, which is what they did, they thought they had, we're in the wilderness. And we covenant together, like the Mayflower Compact, or John Winthrop, City on the Hill speech, we covenant together to form communities, and that gave them, especially reading Locke and Rousseau, explaining it, this characteristically American sense of liberty that didn't exist before. And indeed, Locke's great treatise on government, the first words are, in the beginning, all the world was America. That is, he's projecting back, totally fictionally, that it all began like America. But that's how Americans thought, this sense of liberty. Yet, in the heart of this place where this new sense of liberty, and I think this idea has spread, it's not limited to the United States anymore. I'm sure the Canadians feel it as much as Americans do today. But at the same time, America was I should say the English colonies in the Americas, because it really starts in Barbados, which was the richest and most powerful colony in the Americas. And as you know, it was an offspring of Massachusetts. It was Winthrop that started Barbados, and Barbados was worked in conjunction with Massachusetts. That's where the rum came, the sugar came, and John Winthrop's son started the Barbados colony. But just Barbados became very rich when they discovered sugar as a colony, as a commodity. something they could grow. And so here develops for the first time the modern institution of chattel slavery. Oh, it has its roots in Brazil, but the Portuguese, who were going around to Africa and had these bases, and then they, by a fluke of the Pope drawing a line, Brazil becomes part of Portugal, and they start sugar plantations there, and then they move the sugar with enslaved African workers, and then they exploit that. Well, first the British steal it. They go down and steal the technology, but then they work with the Portuguese. And it's a complex story that I don't know exactly, but I've been down to Barbados a couple times in Brazil and tried to follow it. But these enslaved blacks ends up coming up from Brazil. In fact, the first enslaved blacks in America, that 1619 project, that was a Portuguese slave ship that was captured or something and ended up being taken to Jamestown, or a town right near Jamestown, the wharf near Jamestown, and then they were paraded into Jamestown. So it all goes back in a way to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese dealing in enslaved Africans. But it goes up to Barbados, and the English, everything's regularized, everything's legal, laws, they invent laws and make boxes, and everything's bureaucratic. It's the way the English think. And where everything was sort of hazy before, they come up with the Barbados Slave Code, which creates hereditary chattel slavery. That is, if you're enslaved, all the children by the women are enslaved, all the offspring. If the mother's enslaved, the children are enslaved. And it was a whole intricate code of, you can't be taught to read, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, this very rigid chattel slavery. That is, in the English property system, you became property like cattle. And that specific concept hadn't existed. Sure, there had been slavery forever, but, even in Virginia, before the Barbados Slave Code, these people, they were enslaved, but not necessarily their children, and that's why there were a lot of free blacks in Virginia. But this Barbados Slave Code is then taken up to South Carolina, because South Carolina, when after the Restoration in 1660, they give South Carolina to certain proprietors, and they look for settlers in Barbados, because in Barbados, the small farmers are being pushed out by the large sugar plantations. That's when it becomes the richest colony for the British, because sugar is considered white gold. That's the wealthiest thing. I guess cocaine is white gold now, but this was white gold with sugar back then. Incredible wealth. And of course, France and the Netherlands also had their sugar colonies in the Caribbean. England will have more, like Jamaica. But slavery gets worked into those areas, chattel slavery, and it's been brought up to South Carolina by the Barbadian smallholders who don't even know what plantation crop's going to work in South Carolina. They stumble on rice after trying out silk and some other things, and then rice turns to be as brutal as sugar. Much worse than tobacco. Really brutal to husk and harvest rice in the malarial swamps. Sugar's bad, but rice is terrible too. I wouldn't argue which is better or worse. And both required, they thought, enslaved labor. And so the Barbadian Slave Code came with them. The original constitution of the South Carolina, or the Carolinas, says that every free white man is entitled to his black slaves, enslaved people. And so there it comes. And so in America, there develops, every colony adopts, the southern ones all adopt the slave code based on South Carolina. Virginia does it in 04, early 1700s. Maryland does, Georgia does, North Carolina does, Delaware. And so you end up with this institution of chattel slavery. At the same place, you have these rising ideals of liberty. And in the South, it's existing in the same people. It's existing in George Washington. It's existing in Thomas Jefferson. It's existing within the Pinckneys. It's existing within the same people. And that tension, and then it all explodes into a revolutionary era. And there also was slavery, of course, in northern states. You all know there were enslaved people here in Concord. Massachusetts had a lower percentage of enslaved people, but New York had a high percentage of enslaved people in New York. New Jersey had a pretty high percentage, so did Connecticut. So it was not limited to the South. And so it's that, how can these two things go together? How did they go together in people's minds, this institution of slavery and this idea of liberty coexisting in a revolutionary era? And that's what the book's about. And I limit the revolutionary era, as most historians do. I begin with the Stamp Act crisis. It started right here, as you know. Started right in Boston, to be precise, with the attacks on the Hutchinson and Oliver, led by James Otis and the Candlestick Nine that became the Sons of Liberty, and spread from there. And then as most people, you sort of end it after the Constitution. I go through the convention and the ratification in great detail of the Massachusetts Constitution, which is a very important part of this story, the Massachusetts Constitution, and the time it failed and the time it passed, and then carry it through to the beginning of the Washington administration. So I carry it through the debates in Congress, touched off by Franklin's petitions, and go through the Bill of Rights and basically till just long enough to have George Washington chasing after Oni Judge when she flees his house, and so that's the story I try to tell. That's what I'm debating in my head when I'm doing research. How do this institution and this idea intertwine? And I found out it intertwined in very complex ways.
I'd like to talk a bit more about the slavery metaphor, so particularly help us understand some of these complexities. How did patriot leaders in the American colonies are able to use the term slavery in relation to their own liberty while they're living so closely to chattel slavery? You use many examples in your book. I just wanted to read two quotes. The first is from South Carolina Patriot leader Christopher Gadsden in response to the Townsend Acts. So he says, "We are as real slaves as those we are permitted to command, and differ only in degree, for what is a slave but one that is at the will of his master?" And then the second is Harvard President Samuel Langdon, and this is during the occupation of Boston, right after the battles of Concord and Lexington. So he's describing the colonists' plight as the vilest slavery and worse than death. It's kind of hard to grasp that the colonists who are so close to chattel slavery can compare their own experiences to that oppression of the enslaved. But on the other side, it creates this very powerful image that they must have felt truly, truly oppressed by the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts to draw this very close connection.
Well, it's certainly politically powerful. It was a rhetorical device that virtually everyone employed. And I try to go through a whole chapter, just bring out endless quotes. And when people hear them or read them, they're just shocked, because it doesn't matter who it is. I mean, it starts with the first great pamphlet of the James Otis, the first great pamphlet, 1764, and in Thomas Jefferson's critical pamphlet that gets him elected to go to the Constitutional Convention and the Second Continental Congress, and then gets him picked to write the Declaration of Independence. It's implicit in the Declaration of Independence, but it's in everyone's. It's in their private letters and their public speeches. Endless times, John Adams will shout out, and I know this sounds blunt, but we won't be Parliament's Negroes. Patrick Henry would say something very similar, but he wouldn't use as polite a word as Negroes. And So, I mean, these are the Patrick Henrys, these are the George Washingtons, these are Thomas Jeffersons, these are John Dickinson in the letters from the Pennsylvania farmer, considered the most important protest to the Townshend Acts. It's throughout these things. It's from Letters from American Farmer by Kravica, which came out at the same time. It's ubiquitous. And I think it's a powerful device. Now, it's not unprecedented, except in the way, the vehemence with which it's used. But you can go back to the Whig theorists of the late 1600s and early 1700s, Addison and Steele, and these other people in England, the Whigs who are protesting the Georges as taking too much power. That would be in the mid-1700s. And they're saying, we're in danger of being enslaved. Like the French people are being enslaved by Louis XIV. King Christian is doing this in Denmark. There's a rise of absolutism going on in Europe, and England's are saying the Hanoverian monarchs, the Georges, are going to do it here, and we're not going to be enslaved. But what they meant was sort of a classical allusion to Roman slavery, which is so different than chattel slavery. And of course they had an experience, because there had not been slavery in England since the fall of Rome. I mean, the fall of, what would that be? That'd be over 1,000 years. When were the Romans kicked out of England? About 800? There had been no slavery in England since then. It was only with the Romans that there was any slavery in England. It was illegal. Indeed, if you were a colonial slaveholder and went to England with your enslaved people, they immediately became free when you landed in England, because you couldn't have slavery in England. So the metaphor only worked in the sense that these were classicists and they knew about, stories of Roman slavery. But in America, you saw, right there, you saw enslaved people being beaten. You saw them being chased. You saw them being sold on the street. You saw them being raped. You saw all this stuff. You knew it was going on. George Washington's, Martha Washington's father, how many children did he have? They all looked like Martha, and Martha kept them all enslaved. It was just everywhere. You just couldn't see. Not everyone, I don't think George Washington did that sort of stuff, but it was common. And so you saw how enslaved people were treated. And so if you say, we are being treated that way, or we will be, if we let them get away with the Stamp Act, there's no stopping them. If we let them get away with the Townshend tariffs, there's no stopping them. If the declaratory acts do what they say they're going to do, all submission, all power, that's what the declaratory act says, then, of course, with Boston, after the Tea Party, they take away rights here, and it keeps clamping down. We are going to be totally enslaved. And what metaphor worked for them was, and they used it constantly, as I quoted Sam Adams, we won't be Parliament's Negroes. But they all used it. Jefferson, George Washington, and again, even in private letters when they're writing each other. We're going to be, the famous give me liberty or to give me death speech, we'll be clanking in chains like our enslaved people. And George Washington writing, I think I have a quote in there where he writes, it says, we're going to be just like the people over whom we exert arbitrary sway. And so they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing to enslaved Africans, and they say British is going to do that to us. So, because even if you're not a owner of, even if you are already an abolitionist, even if you already don't have enslaved people, even if you're like Samuel Adams or Benjamin Franklin, you know what it's like. And so and Samuel Adams used it all the time too. And they would say this, and it always used to amaze me. In Dickinson's Letters to the American Farmer, Letters from Pennsylvania Farmer, he says, and this, what we are experiencing, is the vilest, worst, most oppressive form of slavery that can be imagined. Oh, who can imagine a more vile sense? And I said, did he ever ask that rhetorical question to his own 100 enslaved people working on his plantations in Delaware? Really? but that's the rhetoric that was being used. And I think it had force, much more force than when used in England, because of the proximity, the experience with slavery. Now, you'd think, well, if we can't have slavery, well, then we shouldn't have, if we can't be enslaved, well, we shouldn't have slavery. And blacks heard this, and blacks responded to these words. And so you get an upswelling of people, of blacks, huge upswelling of petitions to the government here in Massachusetts, an upsurging in freedom suits by enslaved blacks. And how can you be doing that? And letters from free blacks saying, how can you be doing this how can you be saying this and doing this to enslaved blacks? And so it does react with African Americans hear it and respond to it as well. But it's a powerful rhetorical device, and one that is literally ubiquitous. If you're looking for it, if you're not looking for it, you don't see it. But if you're looking for it, it's virtually in every speech. I took every important pamphlet which historians have defined as important, and I've gone through them all, looking for this use of the slavery metaphor, and it's in every single one. It doesn't matter whether it's Dickinson or Otis or Hopkins, the governor of Rhode Island, or Delaney, all the important ones, they all use, I didn't find any that don't use the slavery metaphor. And often saying this is the vilest form of slavery. So it was an important rhetorical device that carried meaning to blacks as well as whites in the New World. And that to me was, was that the most surprising thing I found? It certainly caught it just, as I was working through these documents, it just was as surprising as anything. That and how slavery actually played out in Philadelphia in the Constitution were probably the two issues. And I'm glad you asked about the metaphor, because the force of it and the ubiquitousness of, and some whites, it does lead some whites to say, like James Otis, he then says, well, then we can't have enslaved people too. A lot of Congregationalists. Before that, only the Quakers, and the Quakers were, viewed as a little bit nutty, and very much ostracized, especially here in Massachusetts, where you like to hang them. They had some opposition to slavery before, but what really develops during this period is a lot of rationalists, people like Benjamin Franklin turn against slavery, Hancock, plenty of rationalists, but also the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church in the Middle States. But up here, the Congregational Church really turns with a vengeance, and that's why things play out in Massachusetts, because the Congregational Church had a lot of institutional power up here. And that's one reason why slavery plays out different, gets abolished early here, as well as Pennsylvania, because there they have the Quakers.
Yeah, speaking of things that really stuck with me, definitely James Otis's pamphlet, the quote that you included from there, it's just so plain and so powerful. The colonists are, by the law of nature, free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black.
And he convinces his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, and she, because he gets hit by the lightning, and he has some hard days ahead. But his sister picks it up, and his sister's pushing it all the time, and she's got a lot of, I don't know if you have a picture of her here, but some of you know about her. She becomes, and her husband dies, I think Warren dies in the Revolution, right? And so she goes on forever, and she is a real firecracker. And she really takes up this cause with a vengeance, too. And I think she's inspired in part by her brother.
So black soldiers fought and died in battles of Lexington and Concord.
Right here.
And throughout the war. You wrote that the Revolutionary War was the last time in American history that black people fought shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers until the Korean War.
Correct.
So how did black people participate in the revolution and make the fight about their own liberty as well?
Well, it depends on where you were. If in the North, militias always had, I believe colonial militias always had some black soldiers in colonial times. But when the revolution conquered, and Lexington, an African-American Minuteman was killed in Lexington.
And Princess de Burke.
Right, fought at Bunker Hill, many died, but many were awarded, got medals for their activity at Bunker Hill. Served in the siege of Boston. And there were free blacks in every colony. There were a lot of free blacks in Virginia, of course, because they didn't have, for that first 100 years, it wasn't really a formalized slavery until the Barbados Slave Code came. And there were free blacks here in Massachusetts. But there were a lot of enslaved blacks. And the enslaved blacks, and both free blacks and enslaved blacks served in the militia. Indeed, in every New England state, colony or state, a higher percentage of blacks served during the Revolution in the militia, a higher percentage than whites. And inevitably, when an enslaved black served out their term, they got their freedom. That was just understood. Connecticut, Massachusetts, didn't matter. You'd get your freedom at the end of your service during the Revolution. And as the Revolution wore on, states had a harder time meeting their quotas that they had to contribute to the Continental Line. And so they increasingly would recruit blacks with the promise of giving their freedom. Also, if you were drafted, like by Connecticut, you could send somebody as a replacement. And who better to send than one of your enslaved people? With the but they had to write the document. And I found a lot of them. Looked at them, saw them myself. The documents are still around. I mean, they are a little troubling that you can send your enslaved black as your replacement, but you have to promise that if they serve the term, whatever a year or whatever the length of the term is, they weren't enormously long, you'd have to guarantee their liberty. But if you signed up yourself, you get a bounty. That is, you get an initial payment. You get paid at the end for having done your service, if the government has any money. But at the beginning, you get a bounty or an award. But if you put your enslaved person up, you get the bounty, not the enslaved person, in Connecticut. Now that is a little bit, but those enslaved people do get their freedom at the end. And so serving in the military becomes a means of emancipation in all of the northern states. It's true in Pennsylvania, it's true in New York, it's true in New Jersey, it's true in all the northern states during the Revolution. The South was the opposite. The South was, they never let African Americans have guns. They never let them serve in the colonial militia of any of the southern states, though there's some dispute about Maryland. I couldn't document it. Some people claim that Maryland let some African Americans serve. I don't think they let them serve in the line. They would maybe let them serve in support positions. Pioneers, they called them, people setting up camp or cutting firewood. But in the North, they were fighting in the line, shoulder to shoulder, and New Hampshire, Rhode Island eventually has an entire black regiment. In all the other states, they were integrated regiments, but they have an entire black regiment in Rhode Island, and they only have 2 regiments. But they also have blacks interspersed, and there are a fair number a fairly high percentage of Africans in Rhode Island because it was such an important slave trading state. Much more important many more slaves were imported to Rhode Island and then distributed from there than in Massachusetts. It was a big state for that because it was more of a shipping state. So in the South, the right to freedom was the opposite. what the British declared, because if you remember, the war was fought initially up here, and then they give up. The British give up. They evacuate Boston, on evacuation day? That would have been in
March 17th.
76, right? And they all go over to Nova Scotia. And then they come back to New York. And they move the war down there because, they're infected with Tories down there. And we all know what a Tory is. Just ask Thomas Paine, and he'll answer that question. And then they try New York, and they don't get very far there either. So then they try the South, starting about 79, after Saratoga, after the defeat at Saratoga. They move down to the South. And then they figure, we're going to take back the Southern colonies because they're more valuable to us because they have the plantations, tobacco and rice. They fit better into our mercantilist economy, and they thought they were more infected with loyalists, with Tories, and so they'd be easier to reconquer, weaker. So what they declare, first early in the war with Dunsmore in Virginia, but then much more importantly, Clinton, who's the overall general in charge, based in New York, he does the Plattsburgh Declaration. And both of them are similar. That is, any African-American, enslaved African-American, who leaves their patriot master, not their loyalist master, but their patriot master, which means Jefferson or Washington or Pinckney or any one of the other ones, any other Thomas Sumner, leaves them and comes over to the British side, will be freed. And so in the South, the route to freedom for African Americans is joining the British Army. And they do by the thousands. By the thousands. As these armies, Clinton's armies and then Cornwallis's armies, march around through Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia, African Americans just peel off. Men and women and children peel off from the plantations into the army, following the army. And it doesn't matter if you become part of the army. You don't have to fight. You just have to leave your patriot plantation, your patriot owner. Now, the British probably had several reasons in mind for that. One, of course, is you weaken your enemy by taking their enslaved people. But another is also the British are pretty good in their propaganda. I mean, the most famous line, but this is not unique. The most famous line is by Johnson, the person who wrote the first dictionary. He said, well, I'd have a little more sympathy, he's in England, a little more sympathy for these Americans crying for their liberty if they weren't being shouted by the drivers of slaves. They're a bunch of hypocrites. They're using that line often, and loyalists are using it often. These people like George Washington is just a dang hypocrite. He's talking about liberty, and he has enslaved people. The British, who didn't have any enslaved people, they're saying this all the time. This is regular rhetoric. They're pronouncing it in the South as they're marching it around, pronouncing it to African Americans. They're calling the Africans out, and they're saying, look, they're calling for liberty. They're a bunch of hypocrites. And loyalists in America, it's constant in the loyalist newspapers, wherever the loyalists control, they're saying, look at the hypocrisy of people like Washington. And he's just the easiest example, but you don't have to stop with him, Thomas Jefferson. And they name them all. And so the Africans peel out of the plantations. As I say, dozens leave Mount Vernon. Whenever troops get close to Mount Vernon, basically they all leave. Randolph loses a lot. I think Lawrence loses them all, and he's the head of the Continental Congress. Jefferson loses dozens and dozens, and they flee to and the British basically keep their word. It gets problematic for them as after Yorktown, they have to consolidate down to their centers, Charleston and Savannah and New York, which they hold for 2 more years until they evacuate. A lot of Africans do die of smallpox. The movements are difficult. The battles are difficult. But in the end, everyone who has come behind their lines who's still alive, they evacuate and they're basically their choice. They go up to Nova Scotia, they go back to England, or they go to Africa. So the result is, when you combine the enslaved Africans that leave the plantations in the South and join the British, the ones that join the American Army or the various colonial militias in the North, and then you add to that, which we'll probably get to, the fact that the northern states in the middle of the war began abolishing slavery. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and then soon others. The Revolutionary War, for all of its mixed pluses and minuses, is the first major emancipation in the history of enslaved Africans in the history of the world. We think of the Civil War, but the Revolutionary War was too, in a more mixed fashion, but it certainly was.
That was going to be my next point, that you call the American Revolution as occasioning the first great emancipation event, and that was really happening during the war and before the war, not necessarily during the Constitution.
Oh, not during the Constitution. That's the retrenchment time.
Yeah.
But Massachusetts here in 1780, you write a constitution that ends slavery. Vermont already has. New Hampshire will soon, and that same year, Pennsylvania adopts the first statute abolishing slavery in any first statute ever passed in history abolishing slavery was Pennsylvania's, and that's in the middle of the war, 1780. The war doesn't end until 1783, so that's in the middle of the war.
Yeah. So my next question ties back to John Meacham's review, which I read during the introduction. So he says that American Inheritance has a good deal to teach those who want to see the American story in overly simplistic terms. This is something we've talked about, how complicated this story that you uncover is. Your approach being quite balanced, you address both the good and the bad of the founders. What were some of the complications that you faced when writing about the founders? And then we can get into the Constitution as well.
Well, if people want to view this as entirely positive period, that America is liberty is blooming out all over, it's a merry month of May, and everything's liberty. Well, that's just not the case. And no one back then thought slavery was ending. Sure, they saw it ending in Massachusetts. Sure, they saw it ending in Pennsylvania, but they certainly didn't see it ending in South Carolina and Virginia. They were clamping onto this even tighter. And so it's a complex story, as I've already said. It was one story in the North, it was another story in the South. And even in the North, it's not like the end of racism, but it's the end of slavery, gradually. So it's a complex story in that way, and there are whites that are instruments of ending slavery. There's an enormous amount of black agency. The blacks very much take up these causes themselves. In all my readings and all my looking, I never got a clue from either reading their master's words or their words where there was ever an enslaved African who wanted to remain enslaved. They were caught up in this movement, and you had the petitions. They were easier to submit in Massachusetts than in some other states, but you also saw the actions and activities in the South. So revolutionary eras, as we all know, change things. There are times when, it's tough to change things when everything's going right. When things are revolutionary and mixing up, things can break and change and get reattached. And that's what we see here. And they break and change and reattach in complex ways, some of which lead to that spirit of liberty as captured with James Otis right at the beginning, spreads to new thinking that had never been there before. I mean, you get a few Quakers talking about ending slavery, but you don't get it it's just not around until this time. Then you see both a religious and a secular movement to abolish, including whites, including Africans, but it is certainly not uniform. And the British, in a calculated way, playing this card, both ways, taking some of these enslaved blacks and giving them to loyalists as rewards. And then in the Southern, not only in the Southern did they didn't let enslaved Africans or free Africans serve in the Southern militia. Now, I said, they gave bounties if you signed up. In the North, those bounties came in the form of money. In South Carolina and Virginia, the bounties were and I think in North Carolina, but I have a lot of documents from South Carolina and Virginia, they were in the form of enslaved blacks that they had taken from loyalist plantations. So when they take them from a loyalist plantations, if you sign up, you're going to get 2 enslaved blacks. Now there you go. Now there's a mixed story for you.
So you spend a whole chapter unpacking the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention. You go on with ratification. Which we mentioned, the Constitution is possibly it's a retrograde step in terms of slavery. They don't necessarily use the term. We see
It's again complicated.
Yeah.
I often get asked, and I have a whole chapter on the Constitution, a whole chapter on ratification. And I follow these debates of ratification very closely.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who ask me, do you think the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And I say, well, it's neither, because the abolition was so strongly embedded in the values of Northerners. I mean, they thought it was God's will to end slavery, whether they were, by this time, they were Congregationalists, they were Quakers, they were Methodists, and they were rationalists, people like Tom Paine. And in the North, virtually every anti-federalist in the North, and you had a lot of them in Massachusetts, because remember, it was very close, ratification of the Constitution, it was very close in Massachusetts. And only Hancock in the end flipped it over, it wouldn't have been ratified in Massachusetts. Well, the opponents all said the Constitution was too pro-slavery. We can't, they would play the religion card. We cannot ratify this because it's too pro-slavery. In the South, every single anti-federalist, like Patrick Henry, said, we can't ratify this because it's too anti-slavery. Indeed, Patrick Henry, the great speaker, at his ratification convention, he says, his speech begins with, don't believe them. If you ratify this, they'll take your, and then uses the N-word. That's what they'll do. If they ratify this, they'll take them from you. So what the Constitution was, because it was written by, Madison, major league, of course an important slaveholder who's protecting slavery, it's not, if it was pro-slavery, it would never have been ratified by northern states. No way. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, they never would have ratified it. If it was anti-slavery, the South never would have ratified it. So they crafted a compromise that very carefully protected state-sanctioned slavery in the states that wanted it. Now, they already had during the Constitution, the Congress adopted the Northwest Ordinance, which said no slavery in the Ohio, Indiana, the parts, Northwest Territories. So there was a route of there was already no slavery in the north, north of the Mason-Dixon line. So it was going to go west with no slaves, Ohio off to the Mississippi River. The South was projecting slavery south. Tennessee and Kentucky were going to come in as soon as there was a constitution passed. Kentucky, Tennessee, and Vermont were going to come in. Vermont is a free state. Kentucky and Tennessee is an enslaved state. So that was all, and then it would continue on in what became Mississippi and Alabama. So they created it in Louisiana. So they created a system which is very carefully calculated and balanced to preserve, protect, and defend slavery south of the Mason-Dixon line going west and north of the Mason-Dixon line going west, it was free. That's what they intentionally created. And if you look at it, the Three-Fifths Compromise is designed to give the South and the North equal numbers in the House. That's what the Three-Fifths Compromise does. And when those states come in, they'll each have an equal number of senators, because there'll be equal number of, when Vermont comes in and Tennessee and Kentucky come in, there'll be equal number of states north and south. And the Electoral College is designed to project that division, because it uses the Three-Fifths Compromise, project it into electing the president. Everything's carefully balanced to keep that going. And I think it may have continued. What ruined it was Roger Taney getting jealous in the Dred Scott decision and canceling the Northwest Ordinance and ruling that all that area out west, north, could have slavery. He broke the compromise, and that's what got Lincoln to join. That's what really propelled us to the Civil War, because this carefully orchestrated compromise was destroyed by the Dred Scott decision, which was what makes that decision. But until that time, off we were going with a House divided.
So my last question, Harold Holzer concludes his Wall Street Journal's review of American Inheritance. Professor Larson has invited us to the belated, unflinching, and painful reading of the will, referring to our American Inheritance. How we deal with the legacy is up to us. The book is about what happened, it's the history. How do you see this work in dialogue with ongoing politicization of the topic, and what do you see the role of American Inheritance, your book, in the ongoing fight for liberty?
Well, as a historian, I'm not a politician. I'm not.
Can you pass him the microphone? I think it died. We just need the microphone. Sorry.
Oh, did mine go
I think
off?
yours might have gone out.
Oh.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So, and I think he caught it, that John Meacham ends his review that says 2 copies of the book should be sent to the governor in Tallahassee, which I suppose is rather humorous. But I liked what Holzer said at the end of the Wall Street Journal, is that's all a historian really can do. Try to tell people what happened. And that was his final line. Now we know what happened. It's up to us to decide what to do with it. And I'm not an expert at deciding what to do with it, what it means for us now. That's beyond my scope as a historian. But I did think it was important to tell the story of what actually happened in that critical period so that people can figure out how they want to deal with it now. And if to the extent I would weigh into it, I would be weighing into it as an amateur, not as a historian.
Well, I wanted to conclude with an episode from the book that Harold Holzer also notes in his review that demonstrates this conflict and this challenge of America's argument for independence, and that's at the end of the war during the British evacuation of New York when English soldiers... Thank you. So English soldiers, Hessians, loyalists, and black people who emancipated themselves through fighting in the war or escaping from slavery were rapidly leaving the city.
Including some by Washington.
Yeah, so these are your words. Also on one of the last ships to leave New York, Daniel Payne, who fled Mount Vernon when the British invaded Virginia in 1780, could watch from the Concord in the New York harbor as fireworks lit up the night sky, welcoming George Washington, his former owner, back to New York following 7 years of British occupation. Paine's story, and throughout the book you illuminate some of these challenging ideas of the nation's founding, where the leader of the Continental Army is lauded for liberating the colonies without liberating his own human property. Professor Larson, thank you for your time today and for helping us better understand this complicated history and the ongoing work for the fight for liberty. Thank you.
Thank you for having me there, and thank you all for coming out on such a lovely day. Do we have time for questions? Or are we out of time?
You can take a question or two, sure.
But we don't need to, we don't want to force them.
No, I wanted to find out, where do you find all this information? Why are you the first to be able to find it?
Oh, parts of it, people, I'm not the first to find it, in the sense that many different ones of these issues, different ones of these episodes, have been looked at, absolutely, by others. All the thing that makes this book is it's the broad sweep, that it covers the whole sweep, rather than just tells the story about Washington and his enslaved people, or the blacks who fought in the Massachusetts militia. Some of that certainly has already been done. Where you can find is there wonderful archives that are available that have all the colonial era newspapers. And I've worked with them because I've worked with several books about this period before. Books on Washington and Franklin, books on the election of 1800. So the newspapers, the pamphlets, of course, because of institutions like the Concord Museum, institutions like the American Antiquarian Society out in Springfield, I think Springfield, Massachusetts, because of the library at Mount Vernon in Washington and in Virginia, the various state libraries. Many of these documents are collected and available and accessible. So you can look at the papers and writings. There's wonderful collections of all the writings of the Adams family, Abigail, John Quincy, all of the Adamses. So what you have, what involved, we're going through those various archives. I had a visiting professorship at Yale during this time, where I could, based at Yale, you could come up to Massachusetts or go down to New York. But you're looking for this particular issue. But parts of them, certainly key parts of the story, like Washington's pursuit of Oney Judge, or the story of Harry Washington, one of Washington's enslaved blacks that fled, those historians have written up. What it is trying to tell the sweep of the story, and there are some people whose story really hasn't. John Hancock and slavery hasn't been talked about too much. Some of these people, people hadn't written as much about. Others, they've written quite a bit. Samuel Adams and slavery is an interesting story. And Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson's interactions. These are stories that I could either found or pulled from others, but put in a broader historical context.
I think that is all the time we have, and we do have books, so Ed will be signing books, and if you have more questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to chat with you. So thank you all.